Okay, now, some of the other things we need to identify in the market. So on the supply side of things. So first, price elasticity of supply. It's defined exactly the same way as price elasticity of demand. It's just that we're going to plug in QS up here instead of QD. So we're asking, how does the change in supply change in percentage terms in response to a percentage change in price? The ratio of those is going to give us the price elasticity of demand. So for example, if the price goes up by 10% and the quantity goes up by 20%, then 20 divided by 10 is 2, so the price elasticity of supply is 2, easy. But if you have a supply function, you can calculate the elasticity of supply using what is essentially the same formula, 1 divided by the slope of the supply function in this case, not demand, times the price divided by the quantity. And that's going to give you a formula that gives you the ability to identify the price elasticity of supply at any particular point on a supply curve. All right, so just in terms of terminology, if the price elasticity of supply is greater than 1, we're going to say that supply is elastic. If the price elasticity of supply is less than 1, it's inelastic. We don't worry about the negatives or positives of the sign here because the supply curve is upward sloping, so it's got a positive slope, and the elasticity of supply is always going to be positive, so we don't have that little awkwardness that we had with the elasticity of demand. And then lastly, just highlight the fact that if a supply curve is relatively flat in appearance, then we would say that that supply is elastic. Notice that little price changes are going to induce big changes in quantity supplied. Little price changes, price goes up by just a little, going to induce a big change in quantity. So therefore, the price elasticity of supply is much greater than 1. Flat supply curves, elastic supply. Steep supply curves, inelastic supply. And that's our interpretation of that. Why do these matter? I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but a lot of times we recognize that different goods have different degrees of elasticity, and that's going to kind of affect the degree or magnitudes of the changes that we're going to see in a particular market. And that's where elasticities become important. How do we identify the magnitude of the change in price or quantity? Mostly, we're just concerned with, does the price go up or does the price go down? Does the quantity go up or does it go down? But when we talk about elasticities, we're getting more into how much does the price go up? Is it a significant amount or is it just a small amount? And that's going to be, economists will always say, will the price go up a lot or not? We'll say it depends on the elasticities. And that means it depends on the sensitivities of supply and demand to the changes in prices. Now, what I've got plotted here is a market, and I've described it as the oil, represented it as the oil market for crude oil. And it's often identified that supply and demand are both relatively inelastic in this particular market, meaning supply and demand curves are both likely to be very steep in their appearance on a particular diagram. And that's because it's hard to substitute away from oil products. We're seeing that right now. It would be good if we could just stop using as much oil, stop burning oil in our cars, and stop powering our power plants with oil. But it's difficult to do that. And one of the reasons is because alternative substitutes are not quickly and readily available at the same prices that we can produce currently using petroleum. As a result, if there's any shifts in supply or demand in the marketplace, it's likely to have very big effects upon the prices that prevail in the market. Steep curves cause small shifts are going to cause big changes in prices. And that's why we often see a lot of volatility in the oil market, one would argue. Prices go up and go down a lot. And that's because a lot of times because of the inelasticity of both supply and demand in the marketplace. Now, the last thing I want to point out with this diagram is just a regularity we identify, that elasticities are very likely to change over a period of time. If we move from a kind of a short run to a long run scenario, what is likely to happen is that both supply and demand will become more elastic over time. They're going to become flatter. And the reason they become flatter is because consumers and producers both can respond and adjust over a longer period of time than they can quickly. And that means the reactions of firms are likely to be less sensitive to price over time. And the same thing is going to be true for demanders. If the price of oil went way up, like we saw in the 1970s, for example, during the oil embargo, it takes time for people to stop using gasoline or stop using as much oil. But eventually, you let a couple of years pass by and people stop traveling as much. They move their purchases to more fuel efficient automobiles. They find alternative sources. They start to bicycle into work. I mean, they do all sorts of different things eventually in response to higher prices to a product. But it takes time for those behavioral changes to take place. And there again, we can kind of talk about elasticities affecting the magnitudes of effect and how those magnitudes will change over time. That's why we introduced this concept of elasticities and why we use it regularly in economics.